Nikolai Orlov stood at the edge of an ice crevasse, gazing at something that shouldn't exist. 2 months ago, a seismic team had recorded an anomaly at a depth of 2 kilometers, a perfectly formed geometric structure that the instruments had initially dismissed as a calibration error. Orlov had demanded repeat measurements because he already had one unconfirmed discovery on his record, which had led to his transfer from Moscow to this expedition. Now the drilling rig stood directly above the coordinates, and his 8-man team awaited a decision, whether to proceed or break camp and report a technical impossibility. Orlov gave the order to drill because retreating would mean the end of his career, and the structure could be a natural basalt outcrop that would save his reputation. Drilling took 11 days. The ice proved denser than predicted, and the temperature at depth remained stable at -32°C, which contradicted all geothermal gradient models for this zone. Technician Gromov twice reported strange readings. The drill bit was encountering resistance that changed not gradually, but in leaps and bounds, as if it were passing through layers of different densities arranged strictly parallel. Orlov recorded this in the log as probable contamination of the sampler and ordered the drill to continue. When the drill bit reached the 2,100-meter mark, it collapsed into a void. The borehole pressure dropped instantly, the pressure gauges dropped to 0, and air began to flow out of the shaft, warm, dry, and odorless. Orlov descended into the reconnaissance capsule with operator Zuev and geophysicist Krasnopolsky. The capsule moved slowly along the guides, the borehole walls reflecting the light of the spotlights as a smooth white sheet, until at a depth of 2,000 meters, the ice ran out. The spotlight struck the void, then illuminated a surface that didn't reflect the light, absorbing it, leaving only a matte gray outline. It was a plane, descending into the darkness at an angle of exactly 52 degrees, and on it were lines, straight lines intersecting at precise angles, without a single bend. Krasnopolsky whispered that this couldn't be a natural formation, and Orlov already knew there was no turning back, because if this turned out to be a mistake, his career would end here, at the bottom of the Antarctic borehole. They returned to the surface 40 minutes later. Orlov called a meeting and announced that the structure required a visual inspection from the inside. Engineer Belov objected. Protocol required waiting for reinforcements and specialized equipment. Orlov cited Clause 6 of the expedition's regulations, which allowed the commander to make operational decisions in the event of a threat to data loss. There was no threat, but Orlov knew that if other teams learned of it, the fine would be taken, and his name would remain in a footnote. He approved the descent plan for the next day and ordered 3 people to be prepared for the research team. Belov noted the objection in the log but signed the document. This was the first violation that could not be undone. The group descended at dawn. Orlov, Zuyev, and junior geologist Timofeyev passed through the borehole on a cable platform and stepped onto the surface of the structure. The material beneath their feet was neither rock nor metal. It remained cold, but it didn't conduct heat, couldn't be scratched by tools, and didn't respond to hammer blows. Lines on the surface extended deep into the void, and when Orlov pointed a spotlight along one of them, the light faded after 20 meters, as if swallowed by darkness. Timofeyev attempted to measure the thickness of the material using through ultrasound, but the instrument showed an error. The wave had gone inward and never returned. They moved along the surface, securing safety cables and marking their path with reflective markers. Half an hour later, they found an opening, a perfectly rectangular cut in the material leading inward. The edges of the opening were smooth, with no signs of damage or processing, as if the material had never been solid. Orlov paused at the entrance because protocol required him to return and wait for the mapping equipment. But he'd already seen how it would appear in the report, a commander stopping in front of an open door. He stepped inside, and Zuyev and Timofeyev followed. The temperature inside was plus 18 degrees. The air was dry and still, without circulation, but breathing was easy. The corridor ran straight ahead, the walls converging at a precise angle, creating a perspective impossible to judge by eye. It seemed to stretch for hundreds of meters, but every step altered the perception of distance. Zuyev tried measuring the length with a laser rangefinder, but the device returned a reading of 407 meters, then 82, then 400 again, without changing the aiming angle. Orlov ordered them to move on, marking the walls with chalk. 10 minutes later, they found the first room, a square chamber about 15 meters on a side, unfurnished, unmarked, only walls with the same lines that intersected in the center of the ceiling. Timofeyev directed the light to the center, and the lines seemed to draw the beam inward. It did not disperse, but he disappeared at the intersection point. They spent 2 hours inside. When they returned to the borehole, Belov was waiting for them at the surface with a report. Radio contact with the base camp had been lost immediately after their descent, and their chronometers showed a 23-minute discrepancy with the reference clock on the surface. Orlov checked his watch. It was 23 minutes behind. Zuyev and Timofeyev showed the same results. Belov demanded that they cease their exploration until contact was restored, but Orlov refused. He had already violated protocol, and stopping now would look like panic. He ordered an expanded team to be prepared for in-depth mapping and sent Gromov to repair the radio transmitter. Gromov went to the equipment and did not return. An hour later, he was found near the generator, standing with his back to the camp, looking at the borehole and unresponsive to calls. When they turned him around, his eyes were open, but his gaze remained blank. He died 3 minutes later, without convulsions or screams. He simply stopped breathing. Orlov forbade anyone approaching the borehole without direct orders and arranged for an autopsy of Gromov's body. Medic Savelyev performed a field examination. The heart had stopped without abnormalities, the lungs were clear, and there were no injuries or signs of chemical exposure. Orlov wrote down a theory of altitude decompensation in his log, even though the site was 2,000 meters high and Gromov had acclimatized. Belov again demanded evacuation, and this time 4 of the remaining 6 men supported him. Orlov refused, because evacuation would mean closing the expedition, conducting an investigation, and destroying all records of the discovery. He cited weather conditions. The weather report predicted a storm in 2 days, making transport impossible. This was true, but Orlov used it as an excuse to buy himself time. He descended into the structure again, this time with Belov and Savelyev. They continued beyond the first room, deeper into the corridor, and found a fork, 3 passages diverging at angles that didn't add up to 180 degrees. Belov tried to draw a plan, but the lines on the paper didn't match what he saw. The angles changed depending on his vantage point. Savelyev began complaining of a headache and suggested turning back, but Orlov insisted on continuing. They chose the right passage and continued for another 20 minutes, until they emerged into a chamber larger than the first, approximately 30 meters across, with a floor covered in the same lines, but here they formed concentric circles converging toward the center. In the center stood a column, a cylinder of the same material, about a meter in diameter, rising up to the ceiling. Orloff approached closer and saw that symbols were engraved on the column's surface, not letters, not numbers, but shapes resembling cross-sections of polyhedrons. He tried to photograph them, but the film only revealed a gray blur. Belov reached out to the column, and Orloff didn't have time to stop him. His fingers touched the surface, and the column emitted a sound. Not a vibration, not a hum, but something akin to a shift in air inside the skull, lasting less than a second but leaving the feeling that time had momentarily stopped. Belov pulled his hand back and looked at Orloff with an expression the latter couldn't read, not fear, not surprise, but something akin to understanding that had appeared too quickly. When they returned to the surface, 4 hours had passed according to the instruments, but the team claimed it had been missing for 8. Krasnopolsky met them with a printout of seismic data. During their stay inside, the structure had been emitting low-frequency vibrations that weren't detected by surface instruments but were recorded by deep-sea sensors. The vibrations occurred at intervals of exactly 60 seconds, and each wave was identical to the previous one. Orloff realized that the structure wasn't dead, it was functioning, and their penetration had initiated a process that couldn't be stopped. He ordered Krasnopolsky to destroy the data, but he refused. Orloff repeated the order, and Krasnopolsky complied, but recorded the refusal in his personal log. This was the moment the team lost trust in him, and Orloff knew it. The next morning, Zuyev didn't emerge from the tent. Orloff entered and found him sitting on his bunk, his gaze fixed on the wall. Zuyev spoke coherently, answered questions, but kept repeating the same thing, that there was no time inside the structure, only sequence, and that they were already inside, even after they had ascended. Savelyev diagnosed acute psychosis and suggested sedation, but Orloff forbade it. He couldn't afford to lose another man. He left Zuyev under observation and called the others together for the final descent. Belov refused to participate, Timofeyev supported him, and in the end, only Savelyev and Krasnopolsky agreed to go down. Orloff understood that this was the last chance to obtain data that would justify the expedition, or at least explain what was happening. They walked to the chamber with the column, but this time the journey took less time. The corridors seemed to shorten, the forks disappeared, and they reached the central room in 8 minutes. The column stood on M. Naturally, but the circles on the floor were now glowing with a dim gray light, emanating not from the material but as if from the space between the lines. Krasnopolsky installed the sensors and began recording readings. The temperature was 18 degrees Celsius, the pressure was normal, but the magnetic field showed fluctuations that didn't match any known model. Orloff approached the column and placed his palm on the surface. The sound repeated, but this time it lasted longer, and with it came the feeling that the structure wasn't closed, it was sealed from the inside, and each visit weakened the seal. Savelyev screamed. Orloff turned and saw the medic standing against the wall, his hands pressed to his head. He was screaming that he could see them all, the entire team standing in this room, but not now, but later, when they were no longer up there. Krasnopolsky tried to calm him down, but Savelyev pushed him away and ran for the exit. Orloff and Krasnopolsky rushed after him, but the corridor changed, the passages branched, the walls shifted, and they lost sight of Savelyev. They shouted, calling for him, but the sound didn't reverberate, it faded into the material and vanished. 20 minutes later, they found an exit and climbed up, but Savelyev was gone. Belov reported that no one had emerged from the shaft after them. Orlov descended again, this time alone. He reached the chamber and found Krasnopolsky's sensors, but their readings were now different. The recording time had shifted forward by 12 hours. He realized that the structure wasn't simply distorting perception, it was isolating everyone who entered, placing them in a separate sequence, out of sync with external time. Savelyev wasn't lost, he simply found himself in a different moment, with no way out. Orlov returned to the surface and found the camp empty. The tents were still in place, the equipment was working, but the people were gone. He checked the logs. The last entry had been made by Belov 3 days before Orlov's final descent. He glanced at his watch, it showed the same time as when he'd entered. He realized his team hadn't disappeared because they'd died, they'd vanished because he'd extracted them from the general timeline and sealed them inside the structure by simply opening it. 2 weeks later, an evacuation team from the main camp arrived at the site. They found Orlov alive, in a functional tent, with a full supply of provisions. He greeted them calmly, handed over all the logs, films, and samples, and then reported that the team had perished in a man-made disaster, a borehole collapse caused by a glacier breach. The bodies hadn't been found because ice debris had sealed the passage at a depth of 500 meters. The evacuation team leader accepted the report, inspected the borehole, and confirmed its closure by a natural collapse. Orlov didn't object. He knew his version would be accepted because the alternative required an explanation that didn't exist. He was returned to Moscow a month later. The commission reviewed the materials, interviewed Orlov 4 times, and concluded that the expedition had acted within its authority but had made critical errors in assessing the geological stability of the site. Orlov was relieved of his command but retained within the system as a consultant on deep-sea exploration. He was banned from returning to Antarctica and prohibited from publishing his findings. All expedition records were classified and transferred to a restricted access archive. Orlov signed a non-disclosure agreement and received a new assignment, at a research institute in Novosibirsk, where he analyzed seismic data from remote regions. He never spoke about the structure again. But every night he dreamed the same thing, a chamber with a column, circles on the floor glowing gray, and Savelyev's voice repeating that they were still there, inside, in a sequence that had never ended. Orlov woke at 3 in the morning Moscow time, the exact moment his watch stopped for the last time inside the structure. He checked it every morning, and it always showed the correct time. But sometimes, when he looked at the second hand, it seemed to move backwards, not smoothly, but in leaps and bounds, as if counting down time, returning him to the moment he gave the command to begin drilling. In 1962, 3 years after the expedition, the Soviet Antarctic program received a request to re-examine the coordinates of Orlov's camp. The team arrived and discovered that the glacier in the area had shifted 400 meters to the east, and the borehole had disappeared. In its place lay a flat ice surface with no trace of the drilling. Ground-penetrating radar showed no cavities at depths of up to 3 kilometers. The structure had vanished, as if it had never been there. But the archives retained logs, grey-washed films, and seismic data that recorded low-frequency vibrations at 6-second intervals, vibrations that continued for 2 years after the expedition's closure, and then ceased as suddenly as they had begun. Orlov learned of this from a classified report. He came across it by accident and realized the structure hadn't disappeared. It had simply closed again, taking with it everyone who had been inside when it was activated. And he was the only one it released, not because he had survived, but because his presence outside was essential to ensure no one else tried to open it.